2016 has been a great year for FX Medicine. We've celebrated the first anniversary of our dedicated website, fxmedicine.com.au. And we're also very honoured and proud to be the recipients of the Complementary Medicines Australia CMA Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Research, Education and Training. We love bringing you relevant content which is designed to improve safety and clinical proficiency. We're so very grateful for your continued support, and please do let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future by dropping us a line on fxmedicine.com.au, Twitter or Facebook. This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining me from Sydney, Australia is Justin Sinclair, who's a practicing naturopath and a consultant and lecturer specialising in herbal medicine and phytochemistry. Justin spent much of his younger years travelling and learning from different cultures about their ethnopharmacological uses of various plants, which led him to formal study in the CAM field in his 20s. After completing a Bachelor of Health Sciences in Naturopathy with the University of New England and diploma-level studies in herbal medicine, naturopathy and nutrition with ACNT in 2002, he went on to study the Master of Herbal Medicines with Sydney University's Faculty of Pharmacy, graduating in 2004. Key areas of study in this program were analytical phytochemistry, pharmacognosy, toxicology, pharmaceutical technology, and medicinal botany. He has published on the topics of pain management and herb-drug interactions in peer-reviewed texts and has held Executive Director and Examiner positions on the Board of Directors for the National Herbalists Association of Australia, that's the NHAA. Justin has had a research interest in medicinal cannabis for the past 6 years, in particular the endocannabinoid system, constituent synergy, that is the entourage effect, novel drug delivery systems for cannabinoids and terpenes, and the use of medicinal cannabis for pain, anxiety and immunomodulation. And we'll be talking about more interesting insights that he has for us today. And welcome, Justin, to FX Medicine.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Always a pleasure.
Justin, today we're going to be delving into the myths and misconceptions around cannabis. So I guess to start off with, we won't go back into the historical use because you eloquently explained that in another podcast, in a previous podcast. So let's go back to the age of Aquarius, the 1960s or thereabouts, Woodstock and free love. Why was marijuana so prevalent around that era? And what was the sequelae from this and why?
You know, I think it was a number of factors, Andrew. Socially, I think cannabis aligned well with the hippie and counterculture movement. It was freely available, it was easy to grow, but also a well-known illicit drug at the time since alcohol prohibition had ended. So using it was, I think, an open rebellion, kind of like a raised middle finger to the government in both the USA and Australia, which was at the time sending that generation against their will to go fight in a war that they didn't want to be involved in. I think furthermore, I think it aligned with the hippie, if you will, mentality of nonviolence. Generally utilizing this plant as an entheogen or a social drug, all you want to do is, sit down, eat and sit down and watch the Muppets or something. You certainly don't want to, or hear of cannabis smoking soccer hooligans going on rampages. That's much more the legal alcohol. So I think it aligned really well with that principle of nonviolence. And I think it also, and perhaps most of all, was about demonstrating a really important facet about one's adult sovereignty. That is that you have a right to decide what you take into your own body as long as it does not hurt others or pose a risk to others. And I think the great philosopher and psychonaut Terence McKenna had a really amazing quote about that. And if I can remember it, it was something like, you can wander around within the sanctioned playpen of ordinary consciousness. We have got some intoxicants over here if you want to mess yourself up. We've got scotch and some tobacco, some red meat, sugar, and a little TV. but the boundary dissolving hallucinogens that connect you with your fellow man and nature are somehow forbidden. So this is an outrage. It's a sign of cultural immaturity, and the fact that we tolerate it is a sign that we're living in a society as oppressed as any society in the past. And I think that even though that quote was actually specifically about hallucinogenics, which is far and away what we're talking about today, but the quote still highlights that discussion about adult sovereignty. And it's a very interesting question and philosophical debate. I mean, who has the right to decide what you do to your own body if it does not hurt another? Can treatments or medications be forced upon you against your will, assuming that you're compos mentis? Do you actually own your own body and mind? Because if others can dictate what you do or do not do to it, is it actually yours? I mean, it's a pretty heavy topic to be sure, and perhaps maybe a discussion for another day over a walk in the forest, mate.
So I guess this goes into the a sort of cultural responsibility, if you like, because, there's this concept that marijuana is a gateway drug. So it's fine if you only want to get into your body, but then if it's going to lead to other things and maybe involve other people or subject other people to criminal activity, then that's where they see the concern. So I've got to ask the question, is marijuana a gateway drug?
Well, I think that's an interesting one, and probably a better question to start with is if it can cause dependence, because right. I think that's the whole guise, is that you become dependent on it, and then suddenly it's not enough for you, so you've got to actually escalate and keep going up. So if I talk about dependence for a while, I can certainly answer that question on whether or not it's a gateway drug at all, if you'd like.
Yeah, well, let's go into that, because my issue with marijuana being a gateway drug, like, we'll talk about this in a sec, but my issue with it is, well, okay, doesn't coffee combine with smoking, and smoking often leads to marijuana smoking, and so couldn't you then say coffee is a gateway drug? So you could argue that point. It'd be flippant. But anyway, so let's talk further about drug dependence and its issues.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, one of the things that I just want to point out from the start, with any of the things that we're going to actually discuss today, all of these myths and misconceptions, is that when we look at these in the evidence, that the discussions around them is based on the cannabis in the literature is illicitly grown street cannabis. And that's something that we need to make really, really clear, because I want the listener to understand that this is a completely different animal altogether to the strains that can be used for medicinal cannabis. Yeah. So, through selective breeding, the recreational or cannabis being used socially has been grown to basically accentuate really high THC levels to get the end user high, and that largely neglected the full profile of the phytochemicals within the plant, whereas that's not the goal of medicinal cannabis necessarily at all. So just as I go through these, I just want the listeners to remember that the statistics that we're talking about have nothing to do with medicinal cannabis, and they have everything to do with illicit, street cannabis. Yeah. So there's definitely evidence within the literature for cannabis being a drug of dependence, and I did spend quite a lot of time going through it and looking at the various studies which have been being published since late 70s and early 80s. But I found this really, really good study that was done by Anthony Warner and Kessler, and it was entitled "Comparative Epidemiology of Dependence on Tobacco, Alcohol, Controlled Substances, and Inhalants." And the reason I really liked this study was because basically it had so many people in it. It was reviewed all sorts of different studies that had already been done, and was based on findings from the National Comorbidity Survey within the United States. And so it actually surveyed over 8,000 people in the USA between the ages of about 15 and 54 on drug use. And the whole idea of the study was basically designed to assess the patterns of dependence. And what was really interesting about the study is that it did show that cannabis can cause dependency, but we need to look at some of the statistics that they raised. And so what was more importantly voiced in this, I think, was that 24% of the study respondents actually had a history of dependence, or 1 in 4 to tobacco. 14%, or 1 in 7, reported dependence to alcohol. And this was all classified as addiction or dependence by the DSM, so, the American Psychiatric Association's publication. So the statistics on cannabis within this subset was around between about 4%, so a little over 4%. So that represents about 6 times less than that of tobacco. And I found another study which said it could be as high as 9%. So the thing that I find quite interesting about this discussion is that we're talking here about an illicit drug, but here's both tobacco and alcohol, which are legally obtainable, and they're not illicit substances, and they have a much higher rate of dependency. So I think there's other factors too that need to come into the discussion about dependency. So we look at things like individual variability of the patient and why the cannabis may have been being utilized. I mean, for example, if someone was suffering from chronic intractable pain or a neuropathic pain and it was non-responsive to medical pharmaceutical treatment and they were actually utilizing an illicit form of cannabis for the management of that condition on a daily basis, then I think that that's acceptable to understand that they could have dependence on it because they're using it for actually a medicinal purpose. I guess the other thing we need to consider too is that as an illicit substance, cannabis is also one of the cheapest to obtain in comparison to other things like cocaine and heroin, which interestingly did show much lower dependency rates. So I think that needed to be considered when that was looked at. And so this, feeds in really well into the discussion of whether or not it's a gateway drug.
But I think just looking at the drug dependence and the sequelae, if you like, or the ramifications of that drug dependence, it's certainly one of the least quote-unquote harmful when you look at the damage that's done by alcohol to not just those people who use the drug, but those people who come in contact with users of the drug. And we're talking obviously about violence here.
Absolutely, completely agree with you.
It sure as hell doesn't happen with marijuana.
Well, no, God. I mean, when was the last time you heard of someone, as I've said previously, I think someone smoking a joint and going home and going on a rampage. I mean, it just doesn't happen.
Maybe if somebody stopped them from getting into the paddle pops, maybe.
It could well be. You never know what could happen then. I mean, but I think, that discussion is really, really important because when we start looking at public health and we start looking at the ramifications, everyone at the moment is currently concerned, we're going to be using cannabis medicinally and what are the ramifications for this? But they're actually blind to what's right in front of their face right now. I mean, we've had these statistics, thrown at us already. In 1999, we've had almost 20,000 Australians die of tobacco-related causes of death. Almost, 5,000 Australians die every year due to alcohol-related disease or motor vehicle accidents. We've got our chronic addiction with sugar, which is, escalating our diabetic populations. These are things that not only have a direct relationship with cause of death and mortality, but actually just as concerning, not more concerning necessarily, but just as concerning is this reality that it's a significant, significantly magnifies these comorbidities and quality of life. And then we extrapolate from there, and the cost to the healthcare system for us to manage people because of the sequelae of your classic alcohol abuse and tobacco use is staggering.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
the cost to the healthcare system is staggering. So for people to be sitting there dragging their feet, using that as an argument, they need to actually look at what's currently legally available.
I just had a thought then about maybe, those people that are concerned about medical cannabis use might have issues because there's so many different types available. But then I thought, hang on, well, let's talk about alcohol. You get the differences or at least the seeming different effects between, say, champagne and rum, which commonly is touted as, making quite a few people punchy. Whereas you don't normally get that with champagne. At least it's not associated with that. But there's a vast array of these alcohol-containing products. Each one of them is different in their makeup, vastly different. Yet we don't seem to worry about that because it seems to be accepted on the basis that they all contain one constituent that's common, but in varying degrees. So again, I don't see a difference between that and different species, strains, types of growing practices. I don't see that as being any different from alcohol.
Yeah, it's a really well-considered point. I mean, I know of many guys that the last thing you want to do is feed them rum because it just turns them into they show a level of violence that from a normally placid person. And I think it's a really good point. Is that everyone that's currently listening to the medicinal cannabis debate is only thinking of it from what they previously know. And the reality is that within Australia and many parts of the world, it's only ever been an illicit substance. And so they're automatically biased.
Yeah.
They're automatically biased. They have no experience, no clinical experience. They may have some practical experience, whether they admit it or not. But the reality is that is for all intents and purposes, a type of cannabis that is grown for a specific outcome, and that is not medicinal cannabis whatsoever. So from that discussion that we were previously having about dependence, we can now kind of broach the topic of whether cannabis is a gateway drug. So that idea of cannabis being a gateway drug is obviously not new, and not surprisingly, there is quite a bit of conflicting evidence in the scientific evidence out there in the literature. So, I mean, when we look at what defines a gateway drug, it's basically a drug that is defined as it can lead to the use of harder, more addictive or dangerous drugs. And some of the examples of these, I guess, are things like, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines. So I think, firstly, we need to consider that as cannabis is obtained from the black market due to its illegality, it obviously stands to reason that other illicit drugs of a harder nature are probably going to be obtainable from a similar source. So this kind of simple association is actually quite difficult to then remove as a confounding variable in some of those study results. But I started looking through some of the evidence for cannabis being a gateway drug, and of course I found some positive ones, but I did find this really interesting and very pertinent paper by Amanda Ryman, and this was published in Harm Reduction Journal. So it was basically stating that cannabis is a substitute for alcohol and other drugs. And so what was really interesting about this is that in California, a state that's obviously legalized medical cannabis dispensaries and patients can get access to medicinal cannabis from those dispensaries from getting a card basically from an authorized healthcare provider. This study was based in California, so it is actually focusing a little bit more not on illicit, it's actually focusing on medicinal cannabis.
Yeah.
So this study conducted was in California in 2008, and it was looking at about 350 different registered medicinal cannabis users. And what they actually found in the statistics is that cannabis may actually exist or serve as an exit drug and not a gateway drug at all. And so I found that really interesting. And so the statistics that were generated from this was that 40% of the respondents reported using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol. Now, I find that interesting because we've already just discussed that alcohol has a higher dependency rate. Then 26% used it as a substitute for other illicit drugs. So we're considering harder drugs or drugs of a harder nature. And 66% used it as a substitution for prescription medication. So I think, that then went on, and they broke that subset down and basically found that 65% of the patients that use medicinal cannabis did so because of a propensity for less side effects.
Yeah.
34% used it for less withdrawal effects. So we're literally talking about illicit and potentially pharmaceutical.
Yep.
And 57% felt that it provided better symptom management for their medical condition. So that being said, of course, we're not going to sit there and say that you want to stop or endorse stopping pharmaceutical medications by any length of the imagination.
No, but if you've got this huge issue with opioid medication where even medicos are under duress now to really watch their opioid prescriptions, and indeed pharmacists are under sort of a moral obligation to look at overuse or continued high use of opioid medications because they have a rebound effect.
Absolutely.
So, for instance, in headaches and migraines, you're actually causing the thing that you were initially treating by continuing to use that medication. So if people can swap over to something that doesn't have that effect, that's a good thing.
I think I completely agree. And I mean, if we're going to start comparing statistics here, I mean, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, they posted in 2010 that over 16,000 people died from pharmaceutically prescribed opioid analgesics.
Yeah.
So that's roughly about 45 people a day.
Yeah.
And that opioid overdoses have quadrupled from the year 2000 to 2014. Now, I know that they're American statistics, but let's look at some Australian ones. In Australia, the rise of addiction to prescription opiates has been particularly noteworthy and devastating. I mean, there was a paper that said between 2002 and 2009, the amount of oxycodone prescribed in Australia increased 180%.
Yeah.
I mean, in the late 90s, I think it was, hospitalizations due to opioid poisoning were largely based on heroin.
Yeah.
But by 2008, prescription opioids accounted for 80% of opioid-related hospitalizations. In Victoria, which actually I think out of all of the states does an excellent breakdown of monitoring drugs and side effects, they actually found that call-outs from ambulance because of opioid analgesics in, I think it was the years 2012 to 2013, increased significantly from years prior. And that there was, I think, 55% increase in the metropolitan Melbourne area. And there's a 21% increase in regional Victoria. So it's not just something that's a city thing. This is something that's still occurring out in other areas. So that amount of oxycodone nationally being prescribed by doctors in Australia, I mean, it's something like 95 kilos in 1999, and it's now 1,270 kilos by 2008, which is representative of about a 13-fold increase.
That's massive.
So, I mean, when we start to think about that, and it's not just the opioids. I mean, the opiates we, of course, have a problem with. But, there's benzodiazepines as well. And I guess the thing that kind of upsets me when it comes to this, and, it doesn't make me chuckle a little. I guess I kind of lie there. It makes me palm my face in staggered disbelief.
Yeah.
Is that pharmacists and doctors are sitting here worried about diversion and dependence with cannabis when this, we have this current problem with opiates and benzos.
Yeah.
And the thing that I worry about is that they sit there and talk about, these checks and balances that we need for cannabis. But these opiates and benzos have passed all those checks and balances for safety and quality and efficacy. Yet we have this problem. And I mean, it's kind of like glass houses and stones.
Yeah, that's right. It is a real dogma. And I don't understand it when you consider that there's already examples out there of variants where all of their arguments are sort of nullified. That's what I don't understand. Yeah.
Oh, look, there was even more interesting. There was a paper actually published, I think it was last year, by a guy called Barkhuber, and he actually published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And he clearly demonstrated that in states where medicinal cannabis laws in the United States are operating, that it's associated with a significantly lower state-level opioid overdose mortality rate. So that actually supports the findings presented in the Ryman statistics. It supports that cannabis is actually potentially an exit drug and not a gateway drug at all. So I think we really need to look at the evidence a little bit more closely. And that evidence that's coming out now for medicinal cannabis is certainly quite encouraging. And we can't get it confused with what has been done on the illicit cannabis in the past. And we need to treat them as separate entities.
Just on a closing point with regards to marijuana as a gateway drug, do you see any evidence of this in states, the Australian Capital Territory and South Australia, the state, where marijuana for personal use is considered a misdemeanor, still illegal, but a misdemeanor, not a felony? So I actually found this thing, and it said that as of June the 2nd, 2015, they were reducing the amount of cannabis that one could be found with from 5 plants down to 2 on what's called the Simple Cannabis Offence Notice, or a SCON. So they're reducing that effect, and it also excludes totally all hydroponically or artificially cultivated cannabis. So that to me is a good thing, because that's what they lace all the bad stuff with. But it seems to be still a misdemeanor, not a felony. Is there any evidence in Canberra and in ACT and South Australia that there is a gateway issue there with regards to other drug use?
Not that I've come across. I mean, one of the things I struggle with is actually finding decent statistics about cannabis use in Australia. To be quite honest, and when we start looking at attributable deaths and all that kind of stuff, the problem is that in many instances cannabis might have been found in the bloodstream, but so was about 2 or 3 other cocktails of prescription or other illicit drugs. So to actually just sit there and strip all of those other confounders away, the other variables, and just be able to point a finger at cannabis is actually quite difficult with what's currently available. And I think that debate about whether people can grow plants for themselves or not, I think that's an interesting one. And what you raise about hydroponics, I think, is also a very important topic, because you've got plants that are basically suspended in a growth medium, and that's not to say that people that really know what they're doing can't produce plants of a very high quality, because of course they can. But the reality is that most of the people growing this are not botanists, they're not phytochemists, they're not horticulturists, and they don't understand the intricacies and the potential problems, because by using different chemicals, that's going to be taken up into the plant, and we don't necessarily know the long-term effects of what that can do to our physiologies.
I think you can bet your bottom dollar, though, that if it's an illegal substance, that it's going to be pump this out quickly and make it grow. So they're going to use any means possible to lace it.
And I guess lacing is an interesting term too, because a lot of the time that term's used where they actually put a different drug in with another drug, and that's sometimes I guess a bit of a confusion, but they use a lot of the different nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus and things like that to bring out the different flowering and leafing stages.
Yeah. And
I think that they're largely safe, but when they start putting different growth hormones and all that kind of stuff in there,
that's what I was referring to.
I think we need to be concerned about that, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, okay, so that therefore, I guess, opens up the issues that medicos might have with growing cannabis. So given that they're going to want a regulated environment, there was some proposition that the administration should be limited to just vaping. So can you go through the usefulness of that and if there's any issues with it? Is that a reasonable way of restricting use to a standardised form, if you like to sort of use that term?
No, I think it's completely myopic, to be quite honest, mate. I mean, what they're not understanding is that the dosage form is actually a critical component when it comes to the efficacy of this plant. It's not just about getting the right the right strain with the right chemistry for the right patient. It's actually choosing that right dosage form. So sitting there and saying that only people can vape a certain cannabis and that's it. Vaping is, of course, very useful. It's not combustible, so you're not getting a lot of the other combustible irritants that can cause inflammation or irritation to the upper respiratory tract. It allows for very quick and direct crossing of the blood-brain barrier. Generally, after inhalation of the vaped product, it's 30 seconds to a minute to maybe 2 minutes tops before you're starting to get the reaction or therapeutic response. But the problem with this is that it's very short-lived. And so that's why I say it's myopic. They're not actually understanding that this is a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
I think it certainly has a place, and I think that for people that a lot of people use that in a day-to-day basis. So if they get a bit of a flare-up or they're experiencing a little bit more pain than normal, they can use those vaping or even just regular smoking to get a very quick onset of action and get therapeutic relief. But most people that are suffering from chronic intractable pain and other chronic conditions generally utilize a lot of ingestible products because it actually has a longer onset of action. It takes a little bit longer to kick in, but it actually has a much longer duration of effect. So it gives them much longer therapeutic coverage. And I think that they need to have all major dosage forms, everything from smoking, vaping, tinctures, infused oils, edibles and those types of things, all the way through to, maybe even suppositories. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways, but we need to understand that dosage form is absolutely critical. And so just limiting it to one I think is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Moving on to other myths and misconceptions, can cannabis lower IQ?
That's a really interesting one. I get asked that one quite a bit, particularly, not surprisingly, from students. But yeah, look, when we start looking at IQ, the old intelligence quotient, a standardized test for intelligence scale. So what are some of the ones that we use, like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Stanford Binet? It's long been espoused, and I think wrongly, I might add, that cannabis use reduces human IQ, and largely this was because they thought it kills brain cells. So just one thing, I guess, before I'll answer this fully is there's a great cannabis practitioner over in the United States. His name's Dr. Sulak, and he's a research chairman for the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. He actually put out a little article not too long ago which attempted to dispel a lot of the inaccuracies around cannabis, and I use that as a kind of a baseline for the discussion of this topic. And as you do, I hit the literature to validate a lot of what was being said. And a lot of what I found in the evidence actually shocked me, because when it comes to these myths and misconceptions, when viewed from a current scientific basis, that, it's all about education, and we've got to educate ourselves to what the actual facts that exist out there are. So, I mean, when we look at that concept of IQ, it's no, it doesn't. They've said in the past that it destroys and kills neurons. And I guess what we need to say here is that consumption of particularly certain varieties of cannabis, those that particularly generally are a little bit higher maybe in THC, can indeed cause a decreased function in short-term memory. Generally, what they found in studies is that the changes are not permanent. And they resolve with cessation. So it's not actually a permanent damage whatsoever. So, obviously, as a rule of thumb, might not be the best idea to use this as a study aid. But they've gone on to do other studies. And I think you'll appreciate this study. They found a review of 2 longitudinal twin studies. Twin studies are really, really great because we're able to separate a lot of other variables, particularly genetic. And so it was conducted by Jackson and colleagues, and I think it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year. And basically it found that cannabis using twins failed to show any significantly greater IQ decline relative to their abstinent siblings. So the conclusion that they drew from that was suggestive, that those observed declines in IQ are probably more attributable to things like familial or other environmental factors. So, I mean, from a phytochemical perspective, the compounds within cannabis have actually been found to be neuroprotective and even neuroregenerative. I mean, in vitro and animal studies have demonstrated certain cannabinoids in cannabis, particularly cannabidiol, so your CBD, can reduce damage to the brain, particularly caused by hypoxia or ischemia, so that lack of blood flow or oxygen supply, and also assists in preventing neurological degeneration in certain conditions like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. Recent research out of the States is also suggesting it can be quite useful for athletic traumatic brain injury, like constant concussions and things like that. So I just think that, the more research needs to be done, but I think based on the phytochemistry and the available evidence and that twin longitudinal study, that I don't think we need to be as worried about cannabis lowering IQ. Where I do want to put a caveat in here, though, because I think this is very important in the interest of balance, is we do need to be a little bit concerned about that with a developing brain. So in children, in the young, we do need to actually be a little bit more wary about this. In adults, when their neuroplasticity and things like that has largely been formed, that's what most of this evidence is based on. But we don't actually have many long, conducted studies or well-conducted studies on how particularly things like THC might affect the developing brain. So it's something that we need to do more research in. And I think that as clinicians and researchers would probably be quite cautious moving with that kind of research. CBD, I doubt, would be as problematic, but certainly we don't, until we know, it's probably not a bad idea to be a little bit cautious about it.
What's been the experience of those countries that have legalised cannabis? And the reason I ask this question is because you get two juxtaposed opinions. So I'll read something that this is from ibtimes.com.
Mm-hmm.
Crime has gone up in Denver by 44% since 2012, according to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, a counting method that has been criticised by police for exaggerating numbers. The FBI estimates that crime has gone up by closer to 3.5% in the same period. So 44% down to 3.5%. Regardless of which system is used, marijuana-related offences accounted for 0.5 to 1% of all crime. So that's one. And the other one was Colorado's crime. This was from AmericanThinker.com. Colorado's crime rate was declining ... until they legalised marijuana. So it seems there's this juxtaposed viewpoint of crime caused by marijuana. What's the truth?
Well, I mean, look, most of the statistics that I've come across, and people that, I know a lot of people that live over in Colorado that have first-hand experience of this, and most of them are actually saying that it seems that crime is down. But I think we need to look at this from a little bit further back. I mean, if you have a drug that is illegal, people will do things to get access to it.
Yeah.
So here we have a state that's actually legalized it, and you can just show your ID, be 21 years of age or older, and go in and use it. So I think that the statistics that are quoted by the police are probably quite accurate in that, well, I don't need to go and break the law to get this, and so therefore I feel comfortable, I don't feel threatened, I don't have to, there's no shadiness about it, it is actually legal. So I think a lot of that social crime around it has probably declined. Where things like that second statistic that you probably come in to talk about might actually be because there's not a great deal of regulation around who grows it and supplies it. So that's when you start getting a lot of competition and, different strains and people that are, or different companies that are getting involved, and they're trying to take market share. And let's be honest with you, this is very big money. There's huge money in this. It's funding schools and road development right throughout Colorado, from taxation on it. But the people and the players that are in the background growing and supplying all of this, it's still a business. And I think that might actually be one of the problems there, is that, healthy competition is maybe not being deemed as important for a successful business model. So I think they need to be kind of looked at separately.
I'm wondering if I might need to clarify a point for our listeners, and that is, we are not suggesting to legalise marijuana so that it is freely available like tobacco or alcohol. We are talking about medicinal use of cannabis, correct?
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
And so in these countries that have quote-unquote legalised cannabis, they're legalising it for medicinal use. They're not legalising it for recreational use.
Well, in some of them they are. I mean, if you go over to, over in the Netherlands, you don't need to, anyone that's gone to Amsterdam would know that quite well, and I believe Portugal is much the same. So it's not just for medicinal use at all, it's actually socially legalised.
And they're not seeing an increase in crime rate even from recreational users? Not
that I've seen in any of the statistics so far. Of course, there's a wide range of them out there, and I've only read a small amount. So,
gotcha.
As a caveat, but I think they do well to implement other strategies to be able to try and mitigate some of those what they might perceive as increased risk factors.
Two quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
What's the link between cannabis and lung cancer? And are there any other harmful or toxic issues with regards to cannabis that we need to be aware of?
That's an interesting one. That smoking, as far as it causes lung cancer, I mean, there was a large study done in about 2006 by Hushabay, and he basically showed that heavy cannabis users have an equal or lower rate of lung and respiratory tract cancers than non-users. Even though cannabis smoke has been proven to contain potentially cancer-causing products based largely on combustion. So what we're talking about there is just, smoking a joint or hitting the pipe, so to speak. So, when we start to consider how is that possible, they basically think that there are therapeutic substances in cannabis that might also have strong anti-cancer properties that therefore mitigate that. So there was another study, I think it was in 75, so we're going back a long time, by Munson, that was actually discussing the anti-neoplastic activity of cannabinoids, and that was in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. So, it's been known since the 1970s, but more recently, cannabinoids have become a major focus of the pharmaceutical industry's anti-cancer drug development as well. And down in LA, I believe his name's Dr. Donald Tashkin. He works out of the UCLA, the University of California of Los Angeles, or University College down there.
Yep.
And he led research in the field of cannabis and its association, particularly with lung cancer. And he could not actually find any direct association. So he actually published a paper in the American Thoracic Journals, I think it was 2012 or 2013, that suggested that the accumulated weight of evidence implies, far lower risks of pulmonary complications. So including other pulmonary diseases like emphysema. So not just to do with cancer. And that it was even heavy use of cannabis compared with the pulmonary consequences of tobacco. But he did point out that, long-term chronic cannabis use can increase risk of something like chronic bronchitis because, as we know, due to epithelial ciliary loss, and it does impair the antibacterial or antimicrobial action of the alveolar macrophages, it usually subsides with cessation of use, just like normal smoking. So while smoking cannabis is unlikely to cause cancer based on some of these papers, it can, of course, irritate the respiratory tract, particularly in sensitive individuals. But generally, most patients and responsible adult cannabis users are actually turning to non-smokable delivery methods anyway. So the vaporizers, like we talked about, allow for users to inhale just the terpenes and the cannabinoid component of the herb without any combustible material, so that's very safe. But then you've also got those tinctures and liquid extracts and capsules and other forms that are there to reduce pain and inflammation. So it's definitely not as much of a problem. But I think in Australia, this is kind of interesting. At least in my experience, we have this kind of interesting cult of putting tobacco with cannabis for smoking, so mulling up, so to speak. And this is, I think, its own potential problems, considering tobacco is a proven carcinogenic.
Yeah, that's right.
And therefore we could actually start seeing skewed results and potentially increase risk. But I think at the end of the day, the debate also boils down to the quality of the cannabis being used, because researchers need to understand that most of these statistics that have been generated over the last 20 or 30 years or even 50 years are strains directly bred to be higher in THC and using less than desirable growing techniques. So, we're basically just talking again about recreational and illicit cannabis and not the specific grown medicinal cannabis strains that are grown to incredibly high quality standards. So, who knows what the implications for dumping all sorts of hormones and other things into the plant might have on the lungs, or the impact of human physiology.
So do you think, just as a wrap-up comment, that the real hurdle here for true compassionate use of medicinal cannabis is that there needs to be some consensus as to the types and or ratios of actives in cannabis that are approved for one to various conditions? So there needs to be, the problem is consensus. Is that the issue?
Look, I think that's a really hard one because when we start looking at limiting, phytochemicals or strains and things like that, we're really starting to reduce the versatility, I think, of the ability for cannabis to be used therapeutically. If we look at, one of the arguments that I've heard in the past is why don't we just use, things like hemp that are high CBD and low THC, and then we don't have to worry about the psychoactivity whatsoever. And I think that they're missing the point. The point is that when we look at the phytochemistry of cannabis, so phytochemicals like your delta-9 THC, the metabolite of that, which is 11-hydroxy delta-9 THC. So this is actually converted within the liver. It's a lot stronger and more potent, and generally has a little bit longer activity. Even delta-8 THC. These are the products within the plant that are considered psychoactive. They make the user feel high or stoned. And so a lot of people will just sit there, will just get rid of it. That's the thing. But, psychoactivity just by definition, remember, is a substance that changes or alters brain function and basically will alter your perception, mood, or consciousness. Okay. So if we take that argument and say just use narrow leaf drug varieties that are rich in CBD and much lower in THC, less than 0.3%, what we basically commonly call hemp, they're still incredibly useful medicines. They don't necessarily engage with the CB1 receptor as much in the central nervous system like THC does. And that's why a lot of people will prefer to use those apparent non-psychoactive strains during the day to assist in, managing their condition. And so they don't feel stoned, and then they'll actually have the stronger analgesic pain-relieving activity of the THC-rich strains to get them through their nighttime sleep, particularly if they're having trouble with pain. So I think when we think about that definition of psychoactivity, remembering that it is anything that can cause a change in perception, mood, or consciousness, case study evidence is actually showing that things like CBD-rich strains that are low in THC are beneficial in addressing anxiety and depression, which are both characterized as mood disorders. So my question then is CBD a psychoactive substance by definition? So it's just something that the cannabis research community, needs to discuss, I think, in a little bit more earnestness. As we're commonly seeing hemp growers using the CBD as non-psychoactive argument in trying to stack or persuade, certain strain selection for medicinal use and somewhat vilifying THC because of the apparent difference. And whilst I certainly wholeheartedly agree that THC is far more psychoactive and psychotropic, I merely, want to bring this up as a discussion for review, because the problem is that a lot of the people in the public and even in scientific circles in the government perceive that THC is a dangerous component and as such, should not be used therapeutically. And I think nothing could be further from the truth, quite frankly. I mean, THC is the main constituent involved in sedation, pain-relieving activity, muscle relaxing activity. And interestingly, this was just published this week. There was a study published in Nature, the journal Nature, no less, in Aging and Mechanisms of Disease, that shows that, cannabinoids have a potential benefit in Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
So I think the paper actually stated that THC reduced inducible Huntington overexpression in certain cells, that THC and other endocannabinoids reduce inflammation, and that several synthetic and plant-derived and also our own endogenous cannabinoids are able to actually prevent the accumulation of intraneuronal beta amyloid, therefore reducing the production of the icosanoids and therefore block inflammation and stop nerve cell death. So it's completely plausible that THC could actually be a useful treatment for AD in the future. So I think we need to look at this evidence again in light of this topic, because it's just one of those things that I feel that if we limit strain selection, if we limit to certain conditions, and I think that that's another problem in and of itself. If we sit there and say that only children with pediatric intractable epilepsy are going to be allowed to use this, what about all the adults with epilepsy?
Yeah.
What about all of the children that are actually suffering side effects? Their epilepsy might be well controlled, but they're getting side effects of the AEDs and therefore are not going to be a benefit to this potential medicinal cannabis scheme. What about the patients with intractable pain that doesn't actually have a diagnosis? So if they're going to sit there and just say, well, you can have it for multiple sclerosis and you can have it for, your epilepsy, and you can use it for chemotherapy-induced nausea, and you might be able to use it for all of these other, specified conditions. I actually think that's a little bit, again, short-sighted. I think we need to actually include symptoms in this discussion. I think that symptomatic management of various things is where cannabis will shine through. I mean, what is it? It's anticonvulsant, pain, for pain management, analgesic, sedation, all of these types of things, reducing spasticity and multiple sclerosis. So I think that they should actually broaden that scope and not actually limit it to certain conditions, but actually use it for approved non-responsive symptoms as well. And I think that is far more compassionate than actually just sitting there saying, I need this diagnosis. Because what if they got the diagnosis wrong?
Yeah. I just want to wrap up this podcast with a quote from, now this is the tdpf.org.uk. We'll put the website up on fxmedicine.com.au. But this is headed Drug Decriminalisation in Portugal, Setting the Record Straight, published 11th of June 2014. Portugal decriminalised the possession of all drugs for personal use in 2001, and there now exists a significant body of evidence on what happened following the move. Moving on to the next paragraph. The reality is that Portugal's drug situation has improved significantly in several key areas. Most notably, HIV infections and drug-related deaths have decreased, while the dramatic rise in use feared by some has failed to materialise. It goes on, so it's an interesting read, but I think it at least partly explains these fears away, and that it also needs to be covered by much wider social implications.
I completely agree. And I think, the medicinal cannabis debate and the social use of cannabis are obviously two very separate things. And, my main interest obviously is just in medicinal cannabis use for therapeutic applications. But what you generally find is in states that it may have been medicinally viable, they generally do start to move towards decriminalisation and legalisation as well. So I think what we need to do is just, start looking at these countries that have implemented these types of systems, particularly from a public health point of view. Look and take that, because the problem I find with having this discussion with academics or medicos or researchers in Australia is that no one has direct experience. Yeah. No one has direct experience of using medicinal cannabis. No one will admit to you that they've used it recreationally. And no one's actually gone and looked at the statistics that exist over in other countries, because, it might not correlate with what the argument that they're trying to display is. And the reality is that if we've got experience in other countries, let's look to that. Let's look at those statistics and let's see how that might apply to Australia and the Australian model, particularly in, just trying to reduce the scaremongering and ease the, don't scare the horses, so to speak, when it comes to the medicos and public health officials and politicians.
Justin, I love your mind and I love the compassion that you have for patients in need. Thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine today.
Always a pleasure, Andrew. Thanks again.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Nominations are now open for the 2017 Bioceuticals Integrative Medicine Awards, the BEMAs. As healthcare practitioners, we care for our patients, and while our therapies can have a major impact on them, there are few opportunities for us to celebrate our success stories as a profession. Now is the time to have your contribution to integrative healthcare recognised. There are many different categories and, as usual, great prizes to be won. For more information, go to the Education tab at bioceuticals.com.au.